Abba Father, in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, we want to thank you because of this morning. We thank you because of the opportunity that is ours to gather here. And as we partake of our activities this day, we want to welcome your presence. We ask for your divine inspiration to rest upon our speakers and performers. May they be vessels of wisdom and insight, touching the hearts and minds of all that we hear them. God, we pray that you may grant our presenters the ability to communicate with clarity and passion, that their words may inspire and uplift, leaving a lasting impact in our attendees. We recognize that you are the source of all inspiration, Lord, and that is why we find your presence this morning. Start with us and be with us to the very end, for we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you, Vincent, for the wonderful prayer. Now we are going to start our session 11. And as today's session, the discussions will revolve around innovative, sustainable research funding in the Global South. And the moderator for today's session is our CEO, Professor Dickson Adara, and I will request him to come forward and start off the session.
Good morning once again. We are delighted that we are on our last day, and being the last day, we've saved the best for the last. And I'm delighted to note that all our panelists and our keynote speaker have arrived, and we shall be expecting our PS today on behalf of the CS to be awarding excelling or excellent researchers who have also arrived. So without much ado, this session is about innovative sustainable funding in the Global South. Having been a CEO of NRF for the last 2 years, I must acknowledge it's a roller coaster when it comes to funding research. And we started on a good note from the government, but the kitty has been dwindling. And given the current scenario, it's been cut further. So in today's sessions, we want to see ways and means for us to be able to sustain research. And our first speaker will be Professor Victor Murinde, who is the Chief Executive Director of the African Economic Consortium. And I'll briefly give you his bio, and then thereafter after he's done with his plenary talk, I'll invite the panelists, who will also be able to give their bios. So Prof. Victor Mwinde, I've already mentioned, is the Executive Director of African Economic Research Consortium. He joined the consortium from School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, where he had been serving as an AXA Professor of Global Finance. Prof. Murinde is a distinguished financial economist spanning over 25 years experience in the university, and as also a practitioner, mostly in consultancy roles. The African Economic Research Consortium was operationalized, I'm not seeing the year here, but he has been in that role from 2011 to 2014. And his contributions to the academic world include 120 research papers in economics, banking, and finance topics. And I must say he's also the founder of the African Economic Research Consortium. Allow me to welcome Professor Murinde to come on stage. I know they'll be projecting his presentation immediately so that he can be able to talk to us. Karibu, Prof.
Thank you, Professor Dixon Andela. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed, let me first thank the organizers of this Kenya National Research Festival 2024 for the excellent idea of getting this work done. Congratulations. And also let me thank Mr. Jordan Kiyongo of the FCDO, who extended an invitation to me and encouraged me to come and give this presentation. And indeed, it's an honor for me to be here and speak about this important issue. And I speak actually from the head, from the heart, because I've been involved in a research work as a professor, and I mentioned, as a funded researcher, almost every year, non-stop for the last 25 years, I've had research grants. But also I come in as a person that has managed research grants, both at the African Development Bank, where I was the founding director of the African Development Institute, and managed huge amounts of research. And also now in managing the research at the African Economic Research Consortium. It's an important issue to understand that there is a challenge in funding research. But great strides, great developments have occurred in the last couple of years. And we're optimistic that, especially for the African continent and for the global south, we should be able to innovate and fund research, especially research to do with Africa. And in a long-term perspective, that should be the way of generating work that can support economic transformation. So that is why I start with a theory of change. A theory of change in which I argue that research is very critical for economic transformation of the global south. That research that generates the parameters, the frameworks, the models that can be used to enhance policymakers by government and also enhance decision-making by the private sector, thereby feeding into high economic growth, higher productivity, and you could argue, in the long run, higher prosperity for the global south and for Africa in particular, and then, of course, in particular also for Kenya. But for that to happen, for research to have that catalytic quality and power, it has to be well funded. And so research funding becomes very critical here. And in my presentation, I'm going to give you a snapshot of where we are now in research funding, the status quo of research funding, the challenges being faced, especially to try to argue, is this an African problem? And then I will build on that to argue that we have to innovate. We have to change the funding models that we use to fund education and research. We have also to look into the financial innovations that have been made and critically draw from financial systems that we have and collaborate with the rest of the world to be able to sustain a high level of funding for research. And then I'll conclude with a message in terms of where we are and what we have to do going forward. So, just let us, from the start, try to visit the status quo. And maybe it would appear that the status quo of funding economic research in the global south and in Africa in particular is that the quo has lost status. And we need to find our way out of that dilemma. And that's because for the last 30 years, the Global South has experienced various levels of funding, research, and development. And that extends to the entire education sector. And if we look at it in terms of what you refer to as gross domestic expenditure on research and development as a share of GDP, the GERD, then it shows that for Africa, this has been about 0.3%. Compared, for example, to North Africa, 0.6%, Sub-Saharan Africa 0.3%, then for the Global South 1.7%, and then a whopping 2.7% for the Global North. It's the gap that we have to close. It is the gap between 0.3% for Sub-Saharan Africa and 2.7% in the Global North. So that's the crux of the matter. That's where funding research becomes an African problem. By calling it an African problem, I mean that it is consistent. It is actually symptomatic of what some of the challenges Africa faces. And so we have to close that gap. And the question is, how do we do it? But let's go into the details. That if you look at the funding, say from Africa, and compare the funding of research with the funding of health and with the funding of the military, you find that it's the funding of education and research that is very, very low compared. So it's a matter of looking at the way the cake is sliced. It's like a capital structure problem. It depends on the decisions policymakers and governments have to make to be able to tilt the balance towards funding research and development on the theory of change that I started with, that it will be catalytic to have research parameters to drive understanding of economic policy and also to drive economic decision making in the private sector. But even when you look at a number of African countries, and here this is a sample, starting from South Africa, including Kenya, and going back to Nigeria, you find that actually up to the first couple of countries, the rest of the continent is almost 0.0001% of funding. That's how dire the situation is. And we need to be able to operate around a mean value, maybe of between 1.2 and 2.7 of GAD, of expenditures on research and education to support development. But even when you look at this in terms of how comparing, for example, Africa and the rest of the world, the Global South, for example, comparing with Asia, comparing with Latin America, we still find that in Africa we are struggling. Of course, this seems to indicate that the problem is symptomatic of the Global South, but also tends to isolate African countries in this problem of funding research across all dimensions of research. Now, the new publication of the Education and Finance Watch 2023 just actually highlights the problem with the Global South and looks at it from where is the finance coming from. Even when you break down the sources of financing for research, research can be funded by government, but in some countries, that's a small proportion. Research can be funded by companies in collaboration with universities, for example. And that may be a component whereby companies have high and expanding R&D sectors, research and development. If you look at budgets for big companies, for example, in Kenya, you would find that a component of research and development is given. Now, of course, when you go into the nitty-gritty, you can even tell which companies and which sectors are devoting a lot of their incomes every year to research and development. This is a question of making priorities And decision-making is all about priorities. So here, what we identify is a misplaced prioritization in Africa, across governments and across also the corporate sector, in terms of what priority is actually being given to research as a proportion of other possible expenditures. And that prioritization is what the decision has to be about. It is the changing of that prioritization. And the question is how? Okay. Just quickly to say that there are some challenges, impediments to why prioritization doesn't occur, on why research and development is not given the priorities that it should deserve. Of course, part of it is the shrinking budgets. For example, right now, we have just been in a global period of short of liquidity. The liquidity squeeze that started about 2 years ago after COVID is mounting. Developing countries, especially in Africa, are struggling to fund expenditures and are short of liquidity, and that's a problem. So in that climate, economic climate, actually allocating funding to research becomes a challenge. However, we need to bear in mind that the research funding is not only for governments, it could be from other sources. And of course, some of the challenges is that if universities, research institutions increasingly go for funding to private, to international donors, multinationals, maybe there is a change in there. And some of it is to think about who is funding research and whether this means that the funders of the research may be able to set the agenda. The old paradigm of research is that universities and research professors try to focus on ideas that are so critical because they are driven by that incentive to find answers to challenging problems. Okay. However, this has to be tempered with the priorities set by other funding agencies, and therefore, research, in a way, becomes a function of who is funding the research. Who pays the piper may sometimes call the tune, and that's the challenge that we identify here. How innovative can we be? And if we are innovative, can we be able to fund research sustainably for the long haul? Is it possible to be able to think of funding research in a single country like Kenya for the next, say, 30 years? And why not? Funds have been set up for infrastructure for 50 years. The African 50 is one of them. So why is it not possible to actually develop a fund using the financial technologies now in vogue that could be able to fund universities of all sizes, could be able to fund research by both universities and corporate sector companies, especially to make innovation and enhance uptake, increase startups, and generate much more productivity and GDP, thinking of a long-term horizon where the costs of funding converge or fall. Why not so? We need to think about how this could happen in terms of, I identify here about only 4 of them, but actually in the course of putting together these slides, I thought this is an area where, I would need to write a paper, and which has empirical parameters, which can test some models, can do some simulations and identify what can happen. Because there are some of the areas that need to be expanded. For example, funding models. A funding model is about how you put together various types of funds to create a big fund for a purpose. Okay. How do you fund climate change? How do you fund infrastructure? How do you fund expansion of universities? How is the funding model? Okay. And I will highlight a little bit about the funding model. The second way of how we can do it is the financial innovation, using the vogue financial technologies at the moment where companies are crowdfunding, using all methods of innovation, creating bonds, creating climate-sensitive bonds. Why is it that we cannot actually tier the funding to education. When education is a big investment, and on top of that, research, which becomes an investment, not only for the government, but also for research institutions and universities. And then to think about the long-term financing aspect, where over time, the cost of financing falls. In terms of funding models, one of the key funding models to invoke Pan-African research funding collaboration. Maybe a Pan-African fund, because Pan-African funds have been set up in other areas, like infrastructure, housing, medical, after the Ebola breakout. Why not funding for research and for education? In fact, here, to give some 2 case studies, this has been tested. The first funding model was the Consortium for Funding the African Economic Research Consortium, which I head at the moment. It was set up in 1988 here in Nairobi, including consortiums, global consortiums, that put together a huge fund. A consortium is a combination of fund. Okay? And that was put together to actually based on single asset of bond and cash payments that sustained the operations for the last 36 years and still growing strong and still liquid and able to fund research. Funded research across 33 countries on the African continent. Funded universities, more than a couple of universities in each country. So this model shows that funding research sustainable for a long time can happen. And the innovation has been always that there is a case. There is a case for a new way of funding, an innovation, looking at the demand side. At that time, there was a need for training African economists to be able to do economic policy work. And that's why you find that that worked a great deal, because there was on demand side by African governments and by the private sector. Now, the demands have changed, and also the funding is changing to sustain the African Economic Research Consortium. So it's a success story as far funding research over the long haul, both in terms of policymakers getting together and also in terms of training. The other successful model has been now the Economic Research Forum. The ERC is for Sub-Saharan Africa. The Economic Research Forum is for North Africa. And this Economic Research Forum also has worked on sustainably to be able to fund research, especially in North Africa and in the Middle East. But also, when the African Development Institute was set up in 2011, and I was the first executive director for that institute, the idea was actually to fund research from trust funds, which was able to fund a number of universities across Africa and set up some centers of excellence. Of course, also, I want to draw here the ARUA, the African Research Universities Initiative, which has been very instrumental. And then I also look at the problem for the funding. Now, I'll skip very quickly in the interest of time. That is the African Economic Research model, the ERC model. It revolves around research excellence, involves around core training, and of course, long-term sustainability. It is involves based on strategic partnerships. Okay, so the secretariat is very small, 34 people only, okay, but cutting across the continent. So the institutions and the networks matter, and that is what is funded in the 3 main areas of actually core research, high quality core research. 18 projects set and judged every 6 months. 18 projects times 5 groups, that is 90 projects that we look at every 6 months. That is huge, cutting across all African countries. And then the training, master's degree, PhD. And then policy outreach, we engage with also policymakers, especially central bank governors and ministers of finance. The African Research Universities Alliance is another successful example of a successful funding model for universities and for research. 16 research universities across Africa are involved. This was set up just only recently in 2015 with the Professor Ernest Taite, who has done an excellent job of getting universities going. What is unique about this funding is that while ERC looks specifically only at the economics discipline, Arua looks across all the disciplines and now has one of the most ambitious target of being able to fund 1,000 PhD students every year for 10 years. So in steady state, that is 10,000 new PhDs on the African continent after 10 years. That's how ambitious can be. But there's something phenomenal about it. It has partnered with other institutional organizations. It is partnering with the African Economic Research Consortium to train PhD students in economics, 70% of whom must be women, and 100 students every year being enrolled in economics across Africa. In steady state, over 10 years, that's 1,000 PhD students. This is as ambitious as can be. It's a solution to funding whereby money is first mobilized. You have a vision, an idea. You mobilize the funding using different instruments. You put together a pot of money, and then you drive it to make more work. And sustainability means 10 years, it will be able to attract other funding that can go on for a little bit more time. And of course, the model is unique, has never happened on the African continent, whereby African universities are twinning with European universities, twinning with North American universities. That's a kind of a tripartite arrangement of a twinning makes it possible. So I think we need to look at the funding models and models of leverage that can work. But also let us look at the idea of having blended financial leveraging for sustainability, whereby basically you get a slice of government funding, even if government didn't expand. Government should expand the amount of GAD. But even if it didn't expand, it can provide a basis for an endowment funding if it commits to a certain percentage, say, for the next 20 years. That could be on about 10% of the total funding. And the other funding then to be mobilized through the private sector and also through using innovative instruments. And by the way, my experience has been over the years that the funding for development and for research is going up ever. I normally focus on the Big 10. The Big 10 is where I focus on a drawing. This, according to the last 3 years, this has been on the top, starting with the Belinda Gates Foundation, Rockefeller Trust, and others. These are the Big 10. There are some newcomers on the Big 10, and these are funding. MasterCard is one of them, but also Bezos Fund is one of them. And these are for universities to plow in and fund any area of work, okay? Of course, the shortcomings are, they may call the agenda, but at the end of it, you have a full army of researchers in African universities or in the Global South, fully cooperating, working with the Global North on key areas of interest. It can't be any better. But we forget one thing. You may have a research ecosystem, and this work is drawn from engagement with one of these projects that has funded this, where you involved the RISA, on which I was heading the research, and Tom was heading the innovation component before I came down to ERC, is that it is important to look at the research ecosystem, but also not to forget that even if the research ecosystem is fully functional, the innovation ecosystem has also to be fully functional. The financing ecosystem has to be fully functional. Why is it that you could get one country offering student loans or even research finance, seed corning experiments, for example, seed corning a production of new financial products? How, for example, should we generate insurance for climate, for weather insurance? If the farmers are hit by weather every year, how can we develop a product to ensure the farmers? This has to be through an experiment. This could be funded. So the ecosystems that are in vogue has to be the research ecosystem, the innovation ecosystem, and the financing ecosystem, both operational. And that way, basically, you have a way of being able to sustainably finance research in an innovation over the long haul. Okay. And it means different stakeholders. These are different stakeholders on my radar for Kenya. Okay. This, if you take the Kenyan economy, these would be the stakeholders that would be involved. So if you only fund 50% of these stakeholders, that is an incomplete picture. And the total funding will remain at 0.03%. God. If, however, as the more stakeholders getting involved in the financing cycle, the more it is possible to increase the investment on research and innovation. So strengthening the financial ecosystem to ensure that banks, to ensure that capital markets, to ensure that non-bank financial institutions are able to fund not only companies, individuals, and universities to be able to expand is an important dimension of expanding expenditure on research and innovation. It could be that we are looking at a way in which research universities and research departments universities are working with corporates. Okay. For example, in the global north, most of the research on new medicines, new chemicals, is done jointly with the university researchers around the world. Okay. So this draws how companies are expanding their research and development through business angels, through their venture capital, through all types of funding of equity capital, through long-term funding and innovative bonds that enable the companies to fund and to be able to expand. And they do jointly with the researchers. Over my career, I have worked in corporates, including the African Development Bank, purely on the research dimension, whereby you are seconded for about 3 to 5 years to be able to undertake research in critical areas. In a way, that means they can fund. Okay. The other, of course, is corporates and individuals. In my previous position, my chair was funded by a financial conglomerate called AXA. Okay. And that's providing funds for 10 years, in which the university is not contributing anything at all. They fund your research, they fund your PhD students, they fund your researchers. That's part of funding research through the private sector. So, and of course, the bond instruments and the bond market is expanding across Africa, is to enable the needs, which could be universities, could be the private sector, could be institutes, generate a specific bond for a specific purpose. And that can be, that's an area that view to innovation and do exploitation and where it can expand, as long as it's going to generate some cash flows to retire the bond within time. What is critically missing so far? I think strengthening the financial ecosystem, as I mentioned, but also the collaboration between industry and academia in the global south is something that has to be strengthened. Maybe through an incentive-compatible structure. What are the incentives? Why should they actually collaborate? And the incentive is missing. And of course, we always think of research, innovation, and commercialization, where university professors can generate patents and own equity in the new product, or generate ownership in the new product. This could be a professor in economics that make a breakthrough in a financial product, could be in the medical sciences, could be in law, areas which are still pending, like arbitration, across arbitration, country arbitration, or a multinational arbitration. Okay, the frameworks that work and are tested. And that's just research. That's innovative research. But we always think of research, innovation, commercialization. And then we forget about the other way around, whereby you have commercialization feeding into further research, further innovation, and further research. So we can look at all those aspects all the way. So in conclusion, let me say that innovative sustainable research funding is crucial, is critical, mandatory for accelerating economic transformation in the Global South. You can call that the accelerator model that can enable research to feed into development. For Africa, it's not only imperative, it must happen because it's a survival strategy. The rest of the world runs ahead of us. Thank you very much.
One more applause for Prof. Murinde. Allow me to invite the panelists, and our first panelist is Dr. Vincent Okungu. Kindly come to the front. Dr. Okungu is a career health economist who has served in various leadership roles and advising and producing policy documentation and presentations on health sector planning, financing, and economic evaluation. His research interests include domestic health financing, financing research and development, healthcare equity and access, and value for money. As a PI and a co-PI in a number of research projects, some of the achievements include forecasting costs for national strategy deployment and finances for sustainable health interventions in Rwanda, thus improving the potential of domestic mobilization of resources and planning health expenditure using the cost model and sustainability plan in Kenya, as well as Rwanda. Dr. Okungu's influence extends to a number of scientific and other positions, including his current role as a senior researcher at the University of Nairobi. He also serves as a senior advisor on sustainable domestic health financing in several African countries. A round of applause for Dr. Okungu. Our next panelist is Prof. Mike Kuria. Come to the front. Prof. Mike Kuria is a colleague, and he heads, or is the CEO of Commission for University of Education in Kenya. He previously served as Deputy Executive Secretary in the University Council for East Africa, whose mandate included quality of higher education in the East African community and its partner states. Prof. Kuria has a wide experience with the higher education sector in matters quality, having been the director, Center for Quality Assurance at Daystar University in Nairobi, Kenya for 10 years. A round of applause for Prof. Kuria. Last but not least, we've got Prof. Catherine Ngila. Prof. Catherine Ngila is well known to me as a co-PI in various and in supervision of various students. Prof. Ngila is the executive director of the African Foundation for Women and Youth in Education, Science, Technology, and Innovation, whose main focus is to provide mentorship to women and youth in the education and STI. She is a member of United Nations 10-member group for Technology Facilitation Mechanism on STIs for SDGs, and a member of UNESCO International Consultative Group of Experts for Women in Science. She is also Vice President of the International Organization for Chemical Sciences in Development. A round of applause for Prof. Ngila. To start us off, I'll request the three who have joined us to give a rejoinder or some remarks on the just concluded plenary talk by Prof. Murinde. I'll start with you, Dr. Kungu, and then we move to Prof. Kuria, and then Prof. Ngila. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you for that wonderful presentation. Fortunately, I'm working on the same subject matter, so we're speaking the same language. So when we talk about the keywords, innovation, sustainable financing, research, those are the keywords. And when you want to innovate, there is a need that you're trying to address. And this need is driven by a national goal. National goals, national policies. We have our goal as a country, industrialization by 2030, and many others that under that goal. So what the professor didn't emphasize so much was about prioritization, because if we have a goal and we need to address these goals, we have, and our needs are quite many. So we need to prioritize. The conversation that I would love to have one day with NRF is, what are our R&D priorities, defined by sector? So if you look at the health sector, you say, these are the issues that we want to address in the next 10 to 15 years. When you look at the agricultural sector, these are our priorities in the next 10 to 15 years. It is after talking about these priorities that we can now talk about models of how these are our priorities. How do we fund? How do we finance these priorities to get us to, give us the status of an industrialized country? So basically, these models are created out of 4 financing sources. It's either the government, that is the public sources, it's the private sector, both corporate and philanthropic, and external sources. Those are the main sources of funding. So out of this, a mix of these sources, that is where we create our models. These models of financing address the priorities, the national priorities that we've created. So if we have defined these priorities, some priorities can be addressed at national level. So we create models that speak to our national priorities. Some priorities may need continental collaboration. For example, if I believe research on HIV is a continental priority. Vaccine manufacturing is a continental priority. Such continental priorities can be addressed through trust funds, for example. Why wouldn't an African Development Bank, for example, create a trust fund that addresses some of these continental priorities, and funding comes from different countries? There are also very low-lying fruits, for example, which we can adopt and in later stages have it as a sustainable way of addressing some of the challenges, some of the research priorities in the country. An example is the grant challenges model, which I believe is a very low-lying fruit because it has a lot of external support, which is not sustainable in the long run, but it is a basis under which we can build our own research for sustainability. I would stop there and give the chance to others to react.
Thank you. Prof. Kuria, please proceed.
Thank you very much. I want to pick 2 things that the Professor Murinde mentioned in passing, but which I think are critical. Let me just begin by saying that I do not think that it's resources that we lack in Africa, or even in Kenya for that matter. It's just the way we are wired. And I think we are wired badly. In the sense that we have been socialized to believe that funding can only come from the West. So I want to pick up the issue that Professor Murinde said, yeah, there's great funding coming from other parts of the world, and yes, they may call the shots, but at least they're providing, and I think I applaud them for what they're doing. I don't have a problem with that. But I'm thinking that we need to think critically about how we change this. I want to give you, because my field is literature, so I give stories. Let me give you 2 stories. One, there was a lady called Audre Lorde. She's a feminist. For that, I didn't tell you that I am, in other part of the world, I'm also a feminist.
Okay.
But this lady, I studied her when I was doing my PhD. She was invited to a conference somewhere where they were talking about empowerment and empowerment of women. But that meeting was mainly organized by white women. And this lady asked, look, you guys, when you came from your homes and you came to talk about empowerment here, you left women working, black women working in your houses as servants. You are okay to see them inferior there, but we come here and talk about empowerment. They said, what kind of empowerment we are talking about? We have to think about difference. We have to think about the ways in which we are disempowered. So she wrote a story, an article, and that article is titled very nicely. It says, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And I think, so I want to pick from what you say. And so if we continue to be dependent on funding from other parts of the world, we are using the master's tools and we'll never be able to deconstruct that house. I think that is a problem we need to have a look at. I also did some literature research in Western Kenya. And in Western Kenya, they have a musical instrument called nyatiti. And I went to the pubs. When they play nyatiti, they praise people. And if you have money, you give them money, and they sing your praises. If you don't like what they are doing, you go and give more money, and so you remember that phrase that he who pays the piper calls the tune. If we continue depending on funding from outside the world, we will continue playing the tune that is called by he who pays the piper. So when I look at the allocations of research that Prof has very ably presented, I am thinking we need to start there and start thinking, what can we do to make sure that research. So in other words, I'm saying, as our good Ngugi wa Thiong'o said, there is a need to decolonize funding in research. And the only way to do that is to make a commitment ourselves. So the dismal allocation of funding by our various governments is quite disappointing. I'm thinking, I know that the African Union has set 2% as the limit that should be funded. Maybe we need to find ways and means of getting there so that the funding can be high. I looked at some countries like Israel, for example, South Korea, United States, Belgium, the countries that we look up to. And you look at the percentage of money that they set aside for research, and it's quite high. For example, Israel, 5.6%, South Korea, 4.9%, United States, 3.6%, Belgium, 3.4%, figures like that. And we are talking about very big budgets here for these countries. They are setting, for example, Israel 5.6% of 547 billion, the GDP. But in Kenya, we are spending, figures vary sometimes from 0 point something to all the highest, maybe 0.8. But for a GDP, that's only 114. You compare that with the US, for example, 3.6 for a budget of 26.7 trillion shillings. It's huge. So we really need, I think, in my view, NRF needs to be given more funding so that they can support research from here, and that's the only way to decolonize research. I could go on, but because of the time, let me just add one more. Maybe we'll have to look at. I knew that Professor Murinde was likely to come with all the innovative ideas. So I didn't prepare any on that score. But there is something that I have seen that maybe we have not learned, especially for our universities. This is the question of funding by alumni. We don't follow our alumni properly. I did my PhD at the University of Leeds almost 20 years ago. Up to today, they write to me. They invite me to join WhatsApp groups. They tell me what's happening. Even when the Prime Minister of the UK became the current Prime Minister, happens to be an alumni of that university, they wrote to me to say, you should be proud of your university. Your alumni has become Prime Minister. They are following up. We are the ones educating these people. How can we try and wire them so that there is a commitment to funding? And I looked at some of the universities and data, and some universities in the West are getting a lot of money from their alumni, which we don't usually do. Stanford, for example, I saw in 2021, they got something like 28.9 billion USD from alumni. Harvard, they raised 9.6 billion from alumni. How much have our universities raised from their alumni? And yet we have billionaires here who have come from those universities. Why didn't we wire them so that they have a little bit of pride in our universities and they can provide some of this money? So just for the time being, let me just stop there. But I do think that we do have the money here and we can mobilize it. Thank you.
Thank you. Prof. Ngila?
Thank you very much, Chair. So listening to the presentation by the keynote, I think it covered quite a good range of issues that we have to consider. But also to top up on just said, so that I can be able to add some points, is that we ask ourselves, our institutions, when we do research in our country, are our strategic plans aligned with the National Development Plan? What is the National Development Plan for Kenya, for example? And how do you tune so that the government funding can be able to fund those projects that are aligned with the National Development Plan? So that is something that I thought about. But also as we go to the donor funders, and also the donor base, what are some of the things that we have to look at? The keynote spoke about looking at the big brothers, that is the multilateral, the bilaterals, and then of course the foundation, the big foundations, your Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and so many other foundations. The question is, have we put our research projects, objectives, are they aligned with the interest of these funders? And if we have got misalignment, then sometimes we apply for funding, and we are not getting it. So that is something that we really have to think about. Quality assurance. And as we think about quality assurance, we have to think about what are the funding methodologies that we are using, for example. I was happy to see that he talked about the new technologies of funding. You go to the social media, make your presence, Kenyatta University, University of Nairobi, all these organizations, all these institutions, are you being noticed on social media? Because sometimes the social media, people are funders, if they are interested in funding Kenya, interested in funding Africa, they are looking to see what is your presence on LinkedIn, for example, what are you saying on your Twitter, what are you saying on different other social media? So that was something that I was happy about. But also very important is the good financial grant practice. So a funder wants to bring money, wants to fund a particular interest, whether it is in Kenya. They're interested in Kenya, for example, Uganda, for example. The question they ask themselves is, this institution in Kenya called University X, do they have, what is their governance? What is their policies in terms of governance? Can they really be able to manage this type of grant? And so the governance is very, very important, because sometimes as individual researchers, we apply for funding, but then our leaders, the leadership, the governance of that institution is not coming to the table. So you have to go around chasing all over the place. The money came to the university. University is not interested. They are not looking at the deliverables. And so towards the end is when they release some bit of money. Of course, the funder will mark, and you are going to you'll be blacklisted. After you are blacklisted as an institution, who is going to give you funding later? And the word goes round. Funder A will tell funder B, A, C, and so forth and so on. So things to think about, like I said, governance, good financial management, human resource, what are our procurement? Because procurement is our biggest problem that we have in this continent, not just in Kenya, but in the continent. that procurement is not aligned with what the funder funded for. Because the funder gives you grant conditions and says, you can do this, you can do this, you can do this, but you are not doing those things. So obviously at the end of the day, when you submit your report, it's going to say, this one is not even doing what we agreed. And so tomorrow they are not going to come back. So sustainability of that funder is very, very important as we think about the new funders. Thank you very much, Chair. I think we are going to have a conversation going forward. Thank you.
I know we've got many questions. In the interest of time, we'll go for at least 5 questions. Then I'll allow my panelists to respond, and then they give concluding remarks. So if you're ready to shoot a question to our able panelists, kindly raise up your hand. We've got a hand here. Mic, please. We can start with the lady, then the gentleman here. Let's start with the lady there. Then your name, your institution. Your name, your institution, then your question, please. She can start, yeah.
Okay. Hello?
We can hear you.
You can hear me? Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm glad that I'm here. I'm Frida Diambokeyo from Maseno University, PhD finalist. So what I want to say about grant funding is I have a question that has been worrying me. There was a time I got some funding from Georgia University. And this funding was from GAIN Kenya, funding Georgia University. So me, I was just given subcontracts in Kenya. And if you can know what I was given, it was very small. The funding was 124,983.57. What I was given, I cannot tell. My worry was, how come this, the study was being done in Kenya. I was contracted to do data collection. I did the elephant work, and what I got was very small. I'm the one who could understand everything because I was coming in Kenya, so I was their co-author, you see. But how come? Does it mean that we could not get this call, or we are not competent enough to get such funding? That is my question. Again, the second question is, I was given this in an institution, and what happened when the money was directed to the institution used it for paying salaries. So I had to look for money to beat the time, you see. I really fought hard at least to get that money. I had even to contact the Georgia University to support me to get the money after I used my money. How can you help us young researchers? Thank you.
Thank you, we've heard you. We've got the lady next to you, then Prof, then we have a gentleman here.
Okay, thank you so much, and good morning. My name is Dr. Sum from Masinde Muliro University of Science and Technology. I have 2 questions. The first question is about as the African countries being donor reliant on research funding. Most often we are forced, as researchers, we are forced to incline or to sing to the tune of the donors. And the African needs, the African specific needs, therefore, are not addressed. So one of the presenters talked about prioritizing. How do we even prioritize the needs of the country when we are depending on the themes that the donors have mentioned? The other question is about the chain of survival for research. Coming from an academic background, you realize that most universities, after the postgraduate students have reported their findings through publications, the chain becomes disconnected in that the implementation bit of the findings of most researchers are not implemented, are not government supported, are not even university supported, because most of these institutions are not supported to end the chain of survival for the research. How do we therefore address this? Thank you.
Thank you. Prof here, then last the gentleman here.
Thank you very much. Good morning, and excellent topic. Professor Mirinde, I want to throw a challenge to you. My name is Ochieng Odero. My initials are JPR. I've been around in the research terrain for a long time. You have talked about innovative funding mechanisms. But there is a history of people who have worked in this area since the mid-80s. Some of you might remember, I think Professor Mishiaka can tell you about the late Professor Thomas Odhiambo, the founder of ISIPE, the founder of the African Academy of Sciences, where Catherine Gila worked, the founder of the Kenya National Academy of Sciences, and the list can go on. He came up with an idea of setting up the African Fund for Africa for Research and Development, AFRAD. And it was built on a very interesting idea, debt for science swap. Excellent idea, negotiated across the continent. Malawi became the headquarters. 3 years down the line, the institution was killed. What am I saying? The rain started beating us some time back. And the rain is continuing beating us. There are people who are not interested in seeing you find solution for funding your own research. The big question, how are you going to deal with that conundrum? I'm happy that you're thinking of writing a paper. Let us write the paper. Thank you.
Thank you. This gentleman here. And the last question, that gentleman. Go first.
Okay, thank you for this opportunity. My name is Simon Peter from Kenyatta University. And my question, I would like to pose a challenge to the National Research Fund on maybe rethinking, because for a long time in Africa, having been exposed to the society in the US, for a long time in Africa, companies think about corporate social responsibility as building boreholes, building water for communities. But has the National Research Fund thought about engaging these companies who operate in Africa, like Google, Microsoft, in creating a consortium? We can do this in terms of counties, like in the US, they do this in terms of states, like counties, whereby every company located in each county has to set aside a certain amount for research, because research is a key aspect in education. Has the National Research Fund thought about that? And also another thing, has research being an important aspect, have maybe proposals been proposed to the governments on including it as part of the curriculum from a younger age? Because some of us got to know about research when we were in high school, finishing high school. That's when we were hearing about the word research. Have you thought about bringing a proposal maybe to the Teacher Service Commission, a change of curriculum? Maybe this should be started from a younger age, and that is what will cause even donors to appreciate the need for dedicating more funds to us, because we can put the cart before the horse about, all these strategies, but have we thought about maybe us creating value in ourselves so that people can see this value from a younger age and nurture these values, like China has done it, Korea with the young kids, and all the developed economies? Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Yeah, thank you all. My name is Gideon Obari, and I'm from Egerton University and Tegemeo Institute. To the keynote speaker, please confirm whether there is a positive correlation between the level of economic development and investments in R&D. And then, after you've confirmed that, maybe you can say something to the effect, where do the sources of funds to budget to support research come from? Are they budgeted for, or those are donor kind of like funded research project? To the Commission of University Education, I think there has been some complaint about procurement and inappropriate procurement procedures leading to blacklisting of universities for further funding. Is there a way that the Commission of University Education can intervene? If not, what do you think then would be the way forward? Thank you.
Thank you. Let me see if there are any other persons with questions. Okay. Let me have my panelists answer the first set of questions in roughly less than 2 minutes. I'll go this way. Question 1 and 2, that one's from Maseno and Masinde Mliro. I'll have them answered by Prof. Ngila and Prof. Kuria. Prof. Kuria being from Q, you can get a Q. Then question from Prof. Odera here, and the two gentlemen. I'll take the one from KU, will be answered by Dr. Kunku and Prof. Mwinde. So, can we, please? Prof. Ngila.
No, thank you very much. So the question from, I think, Frida, from Maseno University. Why did you get such small allocation despite the budget threshold, or should I say upper limit? One of the reasons why you are lucky even you got the money, so you are happy that you got that money. But let me tell you some of the challenges that we face. When you are an early career researcher, sometimes it's advisable for you to pair yourself with established researchers so that you can now be able to be recognized. Your name now starts being floated. If I search Frida, Maseno University, I see Frida, even though she was a co-author. Now, so coming back to why the small amount was allocated, sometimes they look at, do you have track record? How much funding have you been able to obtain? What is your success? Who has funded you before? What type of project it is, so forth and so on. Are the objectives aligned with their interest? Because why would I give you money unless I've got interest? So obviously, you must have read the advert and said, these are the areas that we are interested in, and these are the requirements. Yes, so then you got funding, but the funding was so small. Sometimes it's a test. Maybe even after cycle 1, you would have again gone back and said, listen, I applied for this amount according to the budget, but you gave this amount. Can I stand a chance of doing second cycle of the funding? You can do a follow-up so that they can be able to say, she did well in the first cycle, I think she can do well in the second cycle. So those are some of the things we have to look at. Where a newcomer in a given area, you need to pair yourself with people who are established. Then your name starts being floated, so then you gain going that way. Misuse of funding, we know that it really happens, and I think that is bad manners on the side of our institutions. That when a project is funded internationally or even locally, surely please make sure that you release that money so that the researcher can do the work. Because otherwise you are shooting yourself on the foot as an institution. Because the more researchers in your institutions are funded, the better for you. There's going to be high research and publication rate, so forth and so on. Your name now as an institution starts now being floated among the top universities of top institutions. That is very, very important for you to have that good reputation. So we have to think about tomorrow so that we don't shoot ourselves on the foot. I think since there are two people answering that question, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Prof. Kuria?
Thank you very much. I think, first of all, this just underlines what I began with at the beginning, that as long as we are beholden to someone else to fund us, they will put conditions. And I don't blame them. If I was also giving money for someone to do something, I would put conditions. So I think we have to be ready for that. And what we need to do is find ways and means of generating funds from our side, so that when we go to the table, the negotiating table, we don't go with just open hands. I think this has been one of the biggest problems in Africa. You remember during the COVID-19, we were complaining a lot about the fact that the COVID vaccines were not being distributed fairly. But I was not hearing a conversation, where are we at the production table? We can't just be turning up at the consumption table and not at the production table. In my view, we have to find means of getting there with our own provision and saying, especially if we can get to a place where we say, these are our priorities, this is what we want to research in, this is what we want to find out, these are the problems we want to solve for our part of the world. Do you want to work with us to solve them? Yes. Then here is our money, you bring the money that you have, and then we share this. So I think that's going to be a problem. As long as funding comes from someone else, there will be conditionalities, and sometimes we will play second fiddle, unfortunately. But as the speaker said this morning, we need to strategize and see how best we can make use of what is provided to work in our own interest and in our own benefit. So I'm glad you participate in that particular research. Even if you played whatever, you learned some things. Hopefully you can use those skills later to mobilize funds from around here and from elsewhere, and you rise up the ranks slowly so that you gain more and more power as far as it's become more and more recognized as a researcher. But this is the environment in which we work, and I think, as I said, I don't blame them. I would do the same thing if I was the one giving money. So we just have to find a way of mobilizing our own funds, and therefore then taking control of what happens in our part of the world. Then we can focus on the areas of research that are of our interest, and then we can also give terms and conditions. In my mother tongue, they say that a beggar has no choices. If you are a beggar, you go with the rules and whatever of whoever is funding you. It's an unfair world, but that's how it works, unfortunately.
Thank you, Prof. Kuria. I'll ask Prof. Morinde to answer the question from Prof. Odera. Then question from Obare will be answered by Dr. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mura. Thank you, JPR. Good to see you. And I think you've just put your finger on the right button in terms of the question of the sometimes conflicting incentives behind the setting up of these research centers by national entities versus multinational entities. But I think the long-term perspectives of having indigenous research institutes prevail over the long run is likely to be higher if these institutions are Pan-African, but also they can be global. In my prediction, this is likely to happen, whereby JPR sets up a center for innovation, research and innovation in Nairobi, and gradually it becomes global. That is, it takes on global dimensions and even competes with the global ones. The successful story has been, for example, indigenous banks in Kenya, South Africa, Morocco, and Nigeria have gone global and out-competing most of the multilateral banks that started, say, 50 years ago. This is the kind of innovation that comes from Africa, and of course, later on changes the way international practice. Of course, M-Pesa is one of the other stories. Fintech made up in Kenya that then percolated It's like the waterfalls running the other way up. So it may happen, but I agree with you. It's an obstacle. It's a big obstacle, and the incentives are not aligned. That one I can attest to. But with your permission, Mr. Moderator, I would like to throw an insight into the question that you didn't assign me, but the one that Frida from Maseno University asked. I think you actually identified a problem that I have come across many, many times. The problem to me is in the design. Think of those forms for research grants the way you feel them. Most funding agencies work in terms of time allocation. How many hours are you putting into this project? The time allocation, say 5 hours a day, is multiplied by your salary. And that gives you the value you get at the end of the project for 3 years. That means if there are salary discrepancies between, say, Kenya and the US, right? A person putting the same hours as you are putting in, but has 5 times more the salary, even if you are the same level, you are all lecturers, will get more money. That's a problem. It has to be addressed through negotiation and design. And I thank you for highlighting that, because I could see it straight away. Having been on those form of feeding almost every month of my life, I know that even when as your salary goes up, even when you are joining with other investigators, the component that you take from that project goes up, even if you are contributing the same hours. And that's something that can be addressed through the design. Just this last one. Steve from Edgerton mentioned about correlation between economic development and then R&D. Actually, it works both at the national level, a positive correlation, and also it works at the farm level. Companies that increase their research and development actually tend to generate much more profitability and long-run profitability. This is something that I've generated in my work. What I'm not sure about is whether there is reverse causality, whereby the research innovation, it works the other way around. In other words, it works bidirectionally both ways. This is something that needs to be looked into, and depending on the amount of time it takes for research to categorize development and development to categorize much more research. Thank you.
Dr. Kungu, maybe you respond to the question of CSR.
Thank you. So CSR is just one of the models that research can be funded. But the question that you'll be asked is, I go back to the priorities. The NRF approaches, say, the Microsoft or Google, and say, can we have this condition, and that has to be through some form of legislation, that we need you to deposit at least 0.2% of your net income on research. What kind of research? Because I think the questions have been highlighted across this floor, where research funds come and universities use them to pay salaries, or you take 10 years, ages, to just get your funds to conduct your research. So there is that, the underdevelopment of the research culture, not just within our institutions of higher learning, which are supposed to lead the research, but also other institutions, other academic institutions that conduct research. The research culture needs to be properly developed. But I wanted to respond also to a question, I think, from Mount Kenya University. Two things. One is, if you look at the history of our budgets, the national budgets in Kenya, the past 15 years, nearly every sector has a budget for research. But if you look at where this research is going, where these funds are going, they're going into feasibility studies. So it is 10 years, 15 years of feasibility studies sucking in funds for research, leave alone the funds that are going to Cambridge and so on and so forth. So, and then the other part I wanted to bring out is, I'll give you a story of heads of states meeting in Addis Ababa some time back. I'm not sure which year, but it was at the turn of the century, when the R&D issue was brought on the floor, and the heads of state, one of the heads of state, I think former president of Mozambique, asked, what is that? So there is lack of connection between the role of R&D and economic development, and not just a lack of connection between R&D and economic development. There is a lack of knowledge of the role of R&D overall, not only among policymakers, but also among our own politicians. And generating, or rather mobilizing resources for R&D is first of all a political issue. Until politicians make a decision, for example, allocate 2% of our GDP to R&D, we're still going to depend hugely on external funding for R&D. So the issue of corporate social responsibility is a complicated one, and you cannot put conditions for such companies unless it is out of their own interest that they want to put money on research, because they're also conducting research. And there are also other pressing issues where they feel they should invest in. But that doesn't rule out that as as corporate social responsibility as a model of funding research. The question would be, how much is it anyway? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kungu. I saw a hand from Prof. Nduati and some other three ladies. In the interest of time, we will take those questions, and then we'll be done within less than 10 minutes. So, Prof. Nduati, up front, the mic. Here, up front, here. First here, in the front.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for this presentation on funding for research. I was surprised you didn't focus on the question of building capacity to do research. I think that's where our problem is. The ability to craft a good proposal that gets funded, whether you're looking for money locally or whether you're looking for money abroad. And most times it's assumed that you've done your PhD, so you're able to craft these proposals. And that is not a true assumption. If you look at the US model, in health research, the MD PhD program that has run since the early 1960s, they look for these smart youngsters and support them, a full scholarship through an MD PhD training. And part of your PhD, so you intersect medicine training and PhD training. And in the middle of that, you actually are engaged in research, but research in a team. So you see research as an enterprise, a team, not an individual activity where you go on your own. And from that, you find those individuals who've had that kind of MD, PhD training, they actually get about 25% of the funding from the National Institutes of Health. And I think the National Institutes of Health of the US is the biggest funder for health research globally. So you have to have a strategy. And the training strategy, I didn't hear about it in your programs. And the training, not just training that I'm doing this PhD is around subject X, so I'm an expert on subject Z, but actually broad training so that you can face new situations. You can be able to go and build teams. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Ensure you're the one who raised the hand, the lady in blue.
Thank you. Thanks to the panelists. Pamela Juma from Daystar University. I think my question has been addressed partially, but I wanted to comment first on the issue of capacity building. And giving my own experience, having trained abroad, and then you come back here And because you don't want to stay abroad, most people stay there anyway, but you lack mentorship. After PhD, you realize that you actually don't know research and you need to work with mentors. So such opportunities don't exist here. For you to be able to be a BI, to work with a mentor, some of our senior researchers are very mean. They get grants, they don't want to mentor others, they don't want to engage postdocs in their grants, and they use some of this funding to buy Volvos and use very little to do field work. You can actually engage your master's students, your PhD students in your research projects and help them, because some of the master's students and PhD students don't get funding for research. They use their salaries, they borrow money for research, whereas in that university, there is a professor with 100,000 grants who runs all over with the, in conferences. So mentorship is a big thing. And the second comment I wanted to make was on good grants management practice. A lot has been said about that. But again, we hear a lot of institutions having been blacklisted because they don't utilize their funds well. We have organizations, even here in Kenya, that get push funding, a lot of push funding, because they have good systems in place, whereas big universities don't get such funding. You have people who write proposals, but they don't get funding because their universities have been blacklisted by some institutions. So how can institutions like NRF help us, support us to have, to develop systems that help us manage our funding and account for the resources that we get? I know IPHRC, I don't know whether they're here, they have some funding and they are training some institutions to develop such systems. We can, those of us who are here who don't have such systems in place, you can liaise with them. I don't know whether they're here, but already there are certain things happening. We need to just enhance how we achieve high impact with the funding that we get from outside. Thank you.
Thank you. So 2 last questions, then we wrap up the session. I'll start with the registrar, please. In glasses. Yep.
Thank you very much.
Your name and institution.
I'm Justus Monyoki, Director of Research, University of Nairobi. I think my question and comment comes around the unity of researchers in Kenya. You find that we have researchers across our universities, both private and public, but they tend to work in silos. So what is happening in University A is not known in University B, and therefore chances of duplication of effort. So to NRF, maybe an effort towards uniting this. Both NRF and even Commission of University and Education, we could have a strategy where you try to bring these researchers together, maybe in a symposium like we have now. We know who is doing what in which university. And then we form teams. This is what has happened. It's happening in Europe. It's happening in Africa through the AROA Forum. And even in South Africa, I think efforts are being done towards that. In Kenya, we expose ourselves because main donors now want people who are united, working together, multidisciplinary approach across several universities. Perhaps an effort in that direction could assist. I mean, it's a comment, but can also be responded to by the team here. Thank you.
Thank you. We had one last question from Prof here, my chair. And then we are streaming online, and those questions can still be addressed. And then Prof. Ngo.
Really, Mr. Moderator, really, and the panelists, really, we are not advising properly. And it's not a question. Allow me really to say 1 or 2 things. We have failed as trainers, mentors, managers of any research fund within our institutions. There are 2 ladies, really, I learned their psychology. Maseno, and the one who said, she's just now spoken, she's not getting any mentors. we are mean, the integrity of research really goes to chapter 6 of our Constitution. If I'm the person who raised money or made research grant to a particular university, and that money was misused or put in other uses, that is a rotten behavior, absolutely wrong. Never allow a money given to a particular work in an institution for research, somebody from another country, US, someplace, to now divert that money even for something else. That is totally wrong. There is no integrity. Number two, if I had 10 students really who had raised myself, and I've trained quite a number, reasonably good, as much as possible, they would even take the junk of work, junk of money to use for that work. I think he's asking whether we, National Research Fund, my name is Ratemo, the chairman of National Research Fund, I should really have said that, we should actually train on the utilization and the integrity of use of the fund. And also APHR was mentioned. They are actually training us on the best way to utilize money and appear in the web to be among the best. The last bit one, my brother, CUE Korea. When we write proposals, we participate. No donor would come and say, Michek, I want you to write a paper on the use of paraquat in tomatoes without me telling him or her that paraquat is a pesticide, cannot be used in tomato field. I refuse. They will come and join where the country needs some support. There is no country or there is no organization, Prof, even IDRC, even Rockefeller, that comes and works and says, you do research. That is not close to the country's demand. I think we have a wrong mentality. Although they say those who do the music, this and that, is true. But most times, the researcher would actually sit or communicate on what that research would benefit the country and also a win-win situation to the other donor country that gives money. I may be wrong, but I've done research quite a bit. And my discussions have been alongside the donor person on what I want to do, unless otherwise.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Prof. Ngo, you had a short one or is a long one? If it is within less than a minute, we can take.
Thank you very much, presenters. And I wanted to look at research and ask a few questions. Research is now invaded by artificial intelligence. With artificial intelligence, I am a witness because I am doing research in electrical power systems at the PhD level with several students. My question still, which remains, is with artificial intelligence, we can get wonderful results. However, are we also interrogating our students on how to think about the results obtained? Are we interrogating our students to ask them, what is the impact of the results which you have got on our environment, on our societies? And above all, are the results which you are getting also giving value for the money invested? These are some of the things, as we realize in Kenya, we hear about billions being said here and there. Are we tapping any of those investments? If I've got 1.3 billion worth, how much have I invested in research? If I'm worth 400 million, how much have I invested in research? So these are the real questions which I'm asking, and they are bothering me because so much money is around, but there's so little money to do research.
Thank you. Allow our panelists to respond, each in 1 minute, and I only noticed two of them are questions, the rest were comments. So we'll start with Prof. Morinde, and then Dr. Kunku, Prof. Kuri, and then Prof. Ngila. As well, you give your concluding remarks in 1 to 1.5 minutes.
Let me thank my colleague, the panelists, for the response and the comment on my keynote. I learned a lot from those questions and agree with the observations made. I also want to thank the comments from the floor, very educative. And finally, I want to agree with the lady here who reminded us about capacity building for research. It's very important. The mentorship, publications, and even uptake of that research into policy requires capacity building. I absolutely agree. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Also responding to the issue of capacity building. The problem with research is, first of all, it's really hard work. But the main issue we have in Kenya, for example, and across most of Africa, is the lack of a career path. So you train as a PhD, for example, and you don't have you don't have a mentor. You don't have a PI in your department that can absorb you as a PhD student and a graduate and a PhD graduate to anchor your research career. So that lack of career path is a big impediment to capacity building in research. People don't see research as rewarding, and even trained researchers have to do other jobs that they were not meant to do. So that's a big problem there. The other issue, closely related, is that I come from the university environment, the University of Nairobi. But the interest in research among colleagues is very low. And you can see that only 5% of lecturers in that institution actually have grants. And there is just very little that they can do to absorb the many students who are interested in the research career. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to make 3 comments. I know that Stephen from Egerton University had asked me a question straight away, and we didn't answer it, so I want to just respond to it very quickly. You see, the Commission would not like to micromanage universities. We would like universities to be able to use their systems and structures to make sure things work. However, to the next your question, you asked if you cannot come and interfere with this. We can't, because we want the systems in the universities to work. However, whenever we come for monitoring and we are coming to inspect for progress you are making, there are some reports that we get, including the auditor's report, including all this, and these are governance issues. So I'm sure that when our teams come and we find some of these things, we can advise. We would like to see systems work so that you are rated highly and you are able to attract research. So I think that's a quick one. The second one, point I want to mention, is about industry-university linkage. We didn't talk much about that, but it was mentioned in the presentation. And I want to just go back to what I was saying about the piper payings, who pays the piper calling the tune. It's a little bit. We know we have 3 centers of excellence in Kenya, which were funded by the World Bank. One at Egerton, one at Moi, the other one at Moi, at Jaramogi Oginga Odinga University. And there are 24 of them in the East African region. The World Bank has moved on those particular centers of excellence. In some of those ones, now we're now wondering continuity, what we do about the future of these centers of excellence. So we started them, we did things, but now World Bank has moved on. If we don't come in and say, look, it's our desire to see that agribusiness becomes a key thing at Egerton University. If we don't come back here and say, it's our desire that INSE Foods at Jaramogi Oginga University becomes a key thing in this country and contributes to food stability and food security in this country, it will die if we don't fund it. So this is the point I'm making, that we have to get to that point to say, yes, you might give us seed money, but we must have the dream that is bigger than the project for a short time. If we don't do that, then the piper is making us play tunes that are to their advantage. So I agree with you, Prof, absolutely, that eventually we are the ones who say, let's do it. So we agree. The last thing I want to talk about here And I want to just say that we have seen this problem as the Commission for University Education with reference to mentorship. This is one thing that we are quite weak about, and I know JPR has mentioned this many other times. We don't identify and mentor talent, cultivate talent. That's what the Chinese will call it. We don't do that. Yet when you look at the research in other parts of the world, you see that postgraduate students are actually the ones that drive the research. We don't do that much here. I think we need to get back there and start to look at that. And the Commission, in our strategic plan, that's one of the things we are looking at. And finally, this question of industry and linkage between universities and industry linkage. I think NRF, Q, NACOSTI, Kenya, we need to sit down together and say, what can we advise so that there is greater collaboration between universities and industries are encouraged to invest in the research that is happening in the universities. If you go to Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, for example, they have been doing insect food. They are making biscuits from insects and from cockroaches and things like, not cockroaches, cricket, cricket. And I have eaten some of those biscuits. But if you go to a supermarket here in Nairobi, can you find it? How do we make sure that what he talked about, the movement from research to innovation and then commercialization, how can we support that as a country so that that becomes a practice? I think that is something that we need to look at and see how we can contribute. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll probably just also repeat what others are saying, but then add something. If you look at the current focus at the moment, you realize that there is a lot of emphasis on mentorship, early career researchers, women in science, women in STEM, and so sometimes when we have got these projects, we have to think about what is currently trending. And so therefore, for me, coming from the African Foundation for Women and Youth in Education, Science, Technology, and Innovation, mentorship is very, very key. Women, because we are looking at the percentage of women that are in top research, they are less than 30%. As the CEO of NRF, when he introduced to me, said, I sit in the UNESCO International Consultative Panel for women and looking at the gaps, where the gaps are in terms of improving and enhancing women in science. And 3 areas have been identified by UNESCO. And we are engaging different organizations all over the world. And looking at stereotypes, why are we saying the girl cannot do mathematics? Because you have to think about STEM. Research, STEM, you go hand in hand, because if you're thinking about vaccine development and all that, you have to think about STEM. You can't do without STEM. And of course, health sciences being there. The second thing that UNESCO is looking at is the different pathways for girls to pursue careers in STEM. So you don't simply say you can only be a doctor, you can be a nurse. No, allow the child, the girl child, the boy child, to identify where they have got strength and encourage them. The third area that UNESCO is looking at is sustainability. How do we maintain women professionals in STEM fields? I remember one time when I worked for Kenya, KPC. So in KPC, we had this lady who was an electrical engineer. Then later, when I joined Kenya Pipeline, I found that she told me that she was an electrical engineer, but I found her in environmental health. And I said, but Lucy, why did you move? She said, I was the only woman who was in mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, and so the men were laughing at me and they used to make jokes. So critical mass is very, very important. So she decided to move where there are more women because of support. So that is what UNESCO is simply saying, that we need to support women in STEM if we want to see development in terms of research, because 50% or more than 50% of the population are women. So how are we going to move forward in terms of the United Nations Development Goals if we are not going to carry 50% of the population? Of course, we are going nowhere unless we carry women with us. So mentorship of women and youth for me is very, very important, and that is what I spend most of the time doing. Just to mention, Chair, allow me, maybe responding to Professor Duarte, basically talking about capacity building, and I think she eloquently, explained very well. We have worked very closely with NIH, together with Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, funding health. And so the issue of training is very, very important. At University of Johannesburg, where I still am a visiting professor and I was a chair of chemical sciences, there is a program called mentorship. PhD, doctors, you have to develop the PhDs. And then after that, early career researchers, there's mentorship. A mentorship program, and funds are allocated for that, just to mentor early career researchers so that they can become distinguished and established researchers. So thank you very much for bringing that one very, very home. Talking about, and I think this is University of Nairobi Director, what you talked about, Justice. We are working in silos. Where are we working in silos? Most of these organizations, and the last 2 grants that I applied for, which I didn't get, in all those cases, they were talking about multi-institutional and multidisciplinary. So if we are not going to partner together to say Masinde Muliro is strong in that, USIU is strong in that, University of Nairobi, JQuat, and so forth. And so if we are not coming together, then we are going to be left behind. And that is very, very important. I'm glad that we talked about Arua, what Arua is doing to Professor Misheka. I was happy when you said it's bad manners. That behavior should be discouraged. Why institutions are discouraging our researchers by stealing their money? Money has come from a funder. Why is the institution stealing that money? For heaven's sake. So that is where we are killing ourselves. And finally, I think was it Professor Ngo, when you talked about new technologies, artificial intelligence. Of course, that is the buzzword, artificial intelligence. If you are going to think about the 5th industrial revolution, we are going to have a very small line between artificial and human. So therefore, the 2 of them are going to merge. And so we have to start thinking about, as we move out of the 4th industrial revolution, going to the 5th industrial revolution, are we training what we call the future of work? Are we training our youth in our class, in curriculum? I was happy to talk when we talk about the CSR from Kenyatta University. Communities, are we training curriculum from primary school, secondary school? Are we giving them culture of research? Anything, collecting grasshoppers, put them together in different colors, that is research at primary school. So that is very, very important. We have to think about these things. Chair, thank you very much. I'm sorry I took so much of your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Allow me to once again thank my panelists and indicate that as NRF and all the research institutions present, we are going to work together. For us to ensure sustainable funding, we need to strengthen our research ecosystem, innovation ecosystem, and financial ecosystem. With those, I'll ask my panelists, we be upstanding for a group photo, and then thereafter, the Vice Chancellors in the House will head for a cup of tea from the VVIP room, and then the rest will be guided where to take tea. Then we'll come back for the NORA Awards. Thank you.
Can we give that panel discussion another round of applause? Thank you so much to all our speakers, Prof. Murinde, Prof. Andala, Prof. Kuria, Dr. Okungu, Prof. Ngila. We really do appreciate the insight shared, and we definitely intend to take the learnings forward into the next phases of our journeys in our individual lives and as well as organizations. Another round of applause for all of them, please. Fantastic. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're going for a tea break, and it's going to be half an hour. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I've just been informed we have 2 minutes for our tea break, so please be back in exactly 20 minutes. 20 minutes, 11:15, we do need to begin the capstone of the Kenya National Research Festival 2024, our inaugural one. That is the NORA Awards and the closing ceremony as well. So exactly 11:15, we need to be back here seated. I'll start making announcements from a little earlier as you head out. Please give yourselves a round of applause, and I really, really encourage you to go grab a quick break because we're going to have an exciting end to our program in the next few minutes. Thank you very much.